So let me ask you a question. What if the person you spent your entire life trying to escape, the one person whose approval you told yourself you didn't need, what if they were actually the primary audience for everything you ever achieved? And what if your deepest, most private dream about finally breaking free from that person wasn't even your dream at all?
It's a chilling thought, isn't it?
It's a profound, unsettling knot, and it's one that the renowned psychiatrist Irvin Yalom spends a lifetime trying to untangle. Today, we are diving deep into the intense and often, shockingly personal world of existential psychotherapy. We're focusing on how therapists themselves, the supposedly objective guides, wrestle with mortality, with meaning, and with the impossible complexity of their own human baggage, all while trying to guide us through ours.
And the source material for this is just perfect for that kind of exploration.
Absolutely. The sources for today's deep dive are drawn from the work of a master storyteller and healer, Irvin Yalom, specifically his incredible collection of case studies, Momma and the Meaning of Life, Tales of Psychotherapy. Now, if you don't know Yalom, he is a legendary figure in existential therapy. He's a professor, a psychiatrist, a novelist. He blends this deep clinical insight, earned through decades at places like Johns Hopkins and Stanford, with narrative storytelling that makes these huge abstract concepts about the human condition feel like gripping, immediate short stories.
He really makes it accessible.
He does. And before we jump into this complex and, I think, deeply rewarding material, just a quick invitation to you, the learner. Make sure you subscribe to the deep dive right here on Audiobooks. That way you'll never miss these custom-tailored, captivating summaries of the world's best books and most important research. We're about to unpack the self-aware therapists, and trust me, they carry a lot more than just a notepad and a pen.
Yeah, that's really our mission today. We're explicitly using Yalom's own material, his confessions, his vulnerabilities, his internal struggles, to get a truly raw and, I think, indispensable insight into the therapist's humanity. We're looking at how a healer confronts his own complex family dynamics, his struggles with inventing meaning for himself, and the ethical tightrope he has to walk when these profound, often boundary-challenging relationships are formed with patients. And crucially, we're starting with Yalom's most personal admission, how a world-renowned, highly successful psychiatrist attempts to resolve what he calls his unbroken enmity with his deceased mother.
Okay, let's unpack that. This deeply unsettling introduction, the titular story, Momma, and the Meaning of Life. Yalom sets the stage 10 years after his mother's passing, and he details this complicated, profoundly hostile relationship, an unbroken enmity, he calls it, that defined his entire youth.
And the descriptions he uses they're unsparing. I mean, that's often characteristic of Yalom's honesty, right? He never sugarcoats things. He describes his mother as vain, controlling, intrusive, suspicious, spiteful, highly opinionated.
Wow.
He does grant that she was intelligent, that she had a sachel, a kind of practical wisdom, but that she was also abysmally ignorant. And the emotional reality of it was brutal. He says he never once remembers sharing a truly warm moment with her. He cringed at the thought of introducing friends, and by mid-adolescence, he just stopped speaking to her altogether. He just retreated into conflict and avoidance.
It's the sheer longevity of that hostility that's so jarring. He spent his whole youth trying to escape his past, fleeing this environment that he labels the shtetl, the steerage, the ghetto, and yet, despite all the professional success, all the academic acclaim, the distance, the time, the fact that she's been dead for a decade, he is still internally compelled to ask the ghost of her, "How'd I do, Momma?"
And that's the core paradox of relational trauma, isn't it? I mean, he, the expert, understands the clinical mechanics perfectly. He gives lectures explaining to patients how dysfunctional family dynamics often lead to this kind of unbreakable tether. He says that abused children struggle to disentangle themselves, whereas children who grow away from good, loving parents with far less conflict. He gets it intellectually.
He knows the textbook definition.
He knows it inside and out.
Yeah.
Yet he admits the emotional reality is agonizing. He says, and this is a quote, "He hates it that she has so insinuated herself into the interstices of my mind that I can never root her out." The intellect is just powerless against that emotional reality.
And this unresolved need, this massive emotional debt, it all culminates in this pivotal dream sequence. He finds himself in a cart in the House of Horrors at an amusement park. He's waving to his mother in the crowd below, and he's asking that question that's defined his entire life striving. "How'd I do, Momma?"
Right. And the dream then attempts a kind of highly personalized therapy on him. He rewinds the reel in his mind, the cart backs out into the sunlight, and this time she pulls him out, delivers this big, wet kiss, and offers the ultimate validation. She says, "You did good. All those books. You make me proud."
The very thing he always wanted to hear.
Exactly. But crucially, she admits she hasn't read them because her vision is too poor. Instead, she tenderly fondles the books, proclaiming them big books, beautiful books. The physical, unread books become the tangible evidence of his achievement. It replaces the need for her intellectual engagement, which he probably knew he'd never get anyway.
So the dream provides the reconciliation he spent his whole life earning, but then it forces him to turn inward and really confront his own existential philosophy on meaning-making. I mean, where did that drive actually come from?
This leads right to Yalom's fundamental, skeptical premise about existence. He says, "We are meaning-seeking creatures who must deal with the inconvenience of being hurled into a universe that intrinsically has no meaning." Boo. So if meaning isn't pre-installed, we have to create it. And he proposes what he calls the double task that's required for what he terms existential sanity.
Let's break down that double task because it's just brilliant.
Okay, so the first task is pretty straightforward. We must invent or discover a life-meaning project sturdy enough to support a life. That could be anything: achievement, family, charity, creation.
Sure.
But the second task is where the real trick comes in, the deception. We have to contrive to forget the act of invention and persuade ourselves that the meaning was discovered, that it has an independent external reality.
So it's like you spend years building this massive, intricate stage set, the perfect mountain range, the ideal forest, and then for the rest of your life, you have to successfully convince yourself that those mountains and trees were always there, completely untouched by human hands, because if you admit you built them, the illusion of inherent meaning just collapses.
Precisely. And in the context of his own life, Yalom's meaning project academic success, writing all those books, becoming a renowned psychiatrist, was fundamentally rooted in that second task. He had to believe his success was inherently valuable, not just a function of escaping his mother's shadow. He even stratifies these meaning projects into a hierarchy: brass, silver, and gold.
Right, the brass solution is usually vindictive triumph, proving all your critics wrong. Silver is about peace or detachment or success and power. Yalom's career, you can argue, is a very high-level silver project.
Absolutely. And gold is the ultimate goal. It's self-transcendence, creativity, altruism. Yalom aims for this golden path, trying to turn his entire life experience into what he calls a smoldering inner compost heap to bring forth something new and beautiful. But the dream throws his entire silver achievement into doubt. It suggests it was all just a performance for the blind mama he claimed to despise.
What's so fascinating is how the dream suddenly pivots. It grants him a genuine conversation with his mother. He finally gets to hear her story, and it's brutal. Arriving at 20, working 6 days a week, 12 hours a day in a sewing factory, having to walk her own father Zeta to his newspaper stand at 5 in the morning. Her brothers offered no help while she was supporting her grandparents, Bubba and Zeta, who just sat and read or prayed like a king. She was the engine. She never got to rest.
And this reveals the core conflict from her perspective. He felt her constant criticism, so he built a wall. But she counters that he never listened to her silence when she came home exhausted from the store. And she delivers this profound counter-accusation about his perceived lack of warmth. She says, "First, you never said anything nice about me either. I kept house, I cooked for you. 20 years you ate my food. You liked it, I know, but you never told me, not once in your life."
The shock of realizing that the wall was two-sided, he finally manages to get out, "I thank you, Mama, I thank you." And he takes her arm and he notes it felt soft and warm, something like her warm kishel dough just before baking. It's such a specific sensory detail. He tries to rationalize his need to be free of her influence, telling her, "I want you to be able to rest. You should have your own dreams in life, too."
And this is it. This is where the whole conversation culminates in that stunning, powerful twist. She steps back, her face gets stern, and she delivers the ultimate bombshell. She challenges the very premise of his entire dream. She says, "You know that dream, the one with me standing there in the crowd, watching you in the cart, waving to me, calling to me, asking me how you did in life."
The mic drop moment.
Total mic drop. Your dream. That's what I want to say to you. That's the mistake, Irvin. You're thinking I was in your dream. That dream was not your dream, Sonny. It was my dream. Mothers get to have dreams, too.
Wow. Just wow. So if the dream was her dream, then Yalom has to realize his entire achievement was maybe just a function of her unlived aspirations, her regret that she never had the chance to go to school. I mean, if he was achieving for her, doesn't that just replace his own tyranny of escape with her tyranny of an unfulfilled life?
It absolutely reframes the entire life struggle.
Yeah.
It forces him to confront the ultimate projection. He thought he was inventing meaning for himself, but that meaning was being secretly audited by his parents' unrealized life. His need for success was her desperate, deferred ambition for what she could have done with my head, my Sachel. It's an incredibly humbling lesson for any therapist, or really any person who's achieved success, that you have to distinguish your own true drive from the generational burdens you might be carrying.
That transition from the existential struggle of Yalom, the successful healer, to the profound existential struggle of a patient facing death. It creates such a powerful thematic bridge. It moves us into this idea that meaning isn't just invented, it's also prioritized when time becomes scarce. And this is the theme of learning from patients.
Mhm. This concept was central to Yalom's early education. His mentor at Johns Hopkins, a man named John Whitehorn, taught him, "Listen to your patients, let them teach you. To grow wise, you must remain a student." And Whitehorn meant that patients, often in these extreme circumstances, possess a kind of practical wisdom that can surpass clinical knowledge. Yalom describes his mentor's methodical approach. 2-hour lunches, silent observation, and starting interviews not with trauma, but with a patient's passion. A planter talking about coffee trees, or a professor on the Spanish Armada before subtly shifting to the deeply personal stuff.
That setting allows us to meet Paula, a patient who had this transformative impact on Yalom's entire practice. She was 55, suffering from advanced metastatic cancer. The physical reality of her disease was devastating. Her body was crisscrossed with scars. She'd lost her breasts, ovaries, muscle. Yet, Yalom writes about this first encounter. The most curious thing happened to me the first time I met Paula. I found her beautiful and fell in love with her.
And that visceral response is so key. It signals that Paula transcended her illness in his eyes. Their sessions immediately focused on the ultimate existential questions: life, death, spirituality, peace, transcendence. She became, as Yalom calls her, his courtesan of death, instructing him to demystify death, to see it as a neutral event that ultimately defines life rather than some monstrous evil you have to vanquish.
And central to her teaching was this concept of the golden period. This is a radical idea, almost counterintuitive.
It is radical, especially within a medical system that often prioritizes extending life at any and all costs. Paula defined the golden period not as the process of dying, but as the full living of life in the face of death. She saw the imminence of death as this tremendous source of liberation, a freedom to say no to all trivial obligations and devote yourself wholly to what matters most: friends, family, the sea, the seasons. It's the ultimate forcing function for existential priority.
This philosophy stood in such sharp contrast to the prevailing wisdom of the time, right? Specifically, the famous Kubler-Ross stages of dying, anger, denial, bargaining.
Right, depression, acceptance. Paul was deeply critical of that model. She felt it was overly rigid, and it led to this dehumanization of both the patient and the doctor. Which raises a crucial question, and I think it's one for you, the learner, as well as for the practitioner. If you reject that predictable stage model, how does a hospice worker or a therapist get a handle on the patient's psychological state? Isn't Paula's perspective a kind of luxury that's only available to those who are receiving intensive personal therapy from a guide as thoughtful as Yalom? He had to grapple with that. Is existential freedom only for the privileged few with the time and access to process their mortality?
And the sheer necessity of confronting death openly was magnified by the awful isolation that the dying experience. Yalom learned from Paula that the horror of a terminal illness is compounded by the withdrawal of other people. The foolish charade of forced cheeriness, whispered tones, and doctors who, because they can't fix the central problem, retreat into focusing on wrong parts, like fixing a mild rash.
The patient fears not just the physical end, but utter isolation. Because, as Yalom writes, the terrible truth is that each of us must die alone. To combat this, Paula and Yalom took a completely unprecedented step in 1973. They formed a group for dying patients. At the time, discussing mortality this openly in a clinical setting was almost forbidden. He says dying was as heavily censored as pornography.
They really had to improvise. They needed the doomed, the short timers on death row, and they learned quickly, for instance, that patients on renal dialysis were, in a way, too healthy. Because the hope offered by dialysis postponed death for too long, it allowed denial to take root. They needed patients like Rob, who would lurch wildly between insisting he'd be backpacking in the Alps in 6 weeks and then cursing his paralyzed legs. They needed that raw reality.
And Paula brought the foundational principle to the group. She read them an old Hasidic tale about heaven and hell. In both rooms, people are famished because they can't feed themselves with these very long spoons. But in heaven, they're well-nourished because they've learned to feed each other. And that story became the group's mandate. In the face of isolation, Shared vulnerability and mutual aid are the only real cures.
The power of that mandate was immediate. It was dramatic. It led to this breakthrough with a patient named Evelyn, who was dying but refusing to reconcile with her daughter over a ridiculous, trivial argument about cat food. Sal, one of the group members, just passionately intervened. He urged her, "What does it matter what your cat needs? Break the cycle. Don't die. Please don't die without telling her that. It will poison her life. Break the cycle, Evelyn."
This wasn't professional therapy. This was raw human truth, delivered by a fellow traveler who understood the real cost of unlived life. Evelyn died a few days later, but not before a tearful reconciliation with her daughter. The group, by feeding each other, had provided the ultimate cure, relational resolution before the end.
The group members, feeling that their death sentences that ironically made them wise, they welcomed students to observe through a one-way mirror, to pass on the core lesson that life cannot be postponed. But Yalom, even while he was leading this profound work, was struggling internally. He confesses that he was consumed with succeeding in the academic world, and he feared that Paula's cosmic perspective threatened the foundations of his own dedication to that silver path achievement we talked about.
And that academic frenzy, it eventually caused a deep personal rift between them. When Yalom received funding for a research project, Paula felt exploited and overworked. She accused him of selling out to the bureaucracy. The tension really came to a head when Yalom introduced a Dr. Lee, a medical professional who tossed chalk contemptuously and dismissed Paula's human concerns as maladaptive coping strategies. Paula saw Yalom adopting that same cold, mechanistic, success-driven perspective.
Yalom is so honest about his hypocrisy in this period. He admits he covertly sought comfort from Paula, like he called her late one evening when his wife was out of town because he needed validation, but he demanded that Paula ask for help openly. So when she finally called him, masking her request for comfort as a gripe about the research, he completely failed to notice her distress. She later told him she cried for 24 hours because he had failed her in that pivotal moment of need.
Yeah, the relationship ended bitterly. Paula left the group, refused contact. And the ultimate irony is revealed years later. Yalom encounters a young woman who tells him that Paula is alive, running a lupus support group, lupus, which was caused by her cancer medicine. And Yalom connects this to research showing that cantankerous patients who are paranoid, vigilant, and assertive tend to live longer.
Which is a beautiful, if cantankerous, victory for her. The final holy moment of the reconciliation happens years after that. They're sitting together, they bypass all the clinical jargon, and just remember, they tearfully recall and name the 21 deceased members of their group family: Linda, Bunny, Eva, Lily, Sal, Rob, and the others. And this ritual just cements their shared, profound, and unique experience. Paula tells him, "This is a holy moment, Irv," and he replies, "I remember them so clearly, and I feel your presence, Paula. That's holy enough for me."
The shared experience. That was the true, enduring therapeutic bond. So if the work with Paula represented the absolute heights of deep existential connection, Yalom's experience on the psychiatric inpatient ward, it throws us into the raw, messy, and ethically compromising underside of therapy. This shift transports us to a completely different clinical environment where any kind of connection is just fleeting.
The description of the ward is so visceral: sticky, Lysol-laced air, an environment of strict deprivation, no caffeine, no tobacco, no alcohol, no sex for the patients. He contrasts this so sharply with the cohesion and motivation he found in what he calls his outpatient nirvana. The inpatient reality involved rapid turnover, psychotic outbursts, conning members, zonked out patients, and just tangible levels of despair in the room.
And to survive this environment, Yalom confesses he had to cultivate hypocrisy. He realized the typical lifespan of an inpatient therapy group was often just one single session. The intense despair and the fleeting nature of the connections, it forced him into a kind of professional survival mode. Avoid deep involvement, don't let the patients matter too much, and embrace the mantra, small is beautiful, settle for small goals.
He became a John Stuart Mill utilitarian group therapist. His mission was only to offer the greatest good to the greatest number in those fleeting 50-minute sessions. This pragmatism led to the structure of the agenda group. Patients had to be oriented times 3, time, place, and person, and they had to formulate an agenda. Some aspect of themselves they wished to change, ideally relating to relationship skills, which was the group's one real strength.
And this structured approach often consumed half the meeting. I mean, can you imagine? Asking these severely troubled people like Martin with a wasting disease who'd attempted suicide, Carol, an anorexic, Dorothy with a paralyzed bladder, Rosa, also anorexic, feels inferior, and Magnolia with paralyzed legs and insect hallucinations, asking them to clearly identify a problem and ask for help. The desperation in that room made Yalom feel his promise of help with relationships seemed puny and foolish.
The case of Magnolia, though, perfectly illustrates the razor-thin line between that clinical survival and a really profound intervention. Magnolia, one of the most memorable characters, she initially offers this textbook deflection for her agenda. She says, "I'd like to learn to listen better in this group. Don't you think that would be a good thing, doctor?" A clear attempt to evade being helped by focusing on some external safe skill.
But the group, in a rare moment of functional cohesion, they challenge this. Rosa and Martin highlight Magnolia's immense capacity for giving. She'd raised 15 foster children. She was the nurse's confidant on the ward, and Magnolia confirms it.
Feels good to help out. That's my best medicine. And this is where Yalom's personal shadow enters the room.
He is utterly entranced by Magnolia, and he recognizes this powerful, very unprofessional feeling. He sees her arms with generous folds of flesh cascading down, just like his mother's arms, and he thinks, I need comfort. Magnolia comfort, that's what I need. This countertransference, his own unresolved need for maternal comfort, is active and raw and present right there in the room with them. Now, this is the ethical tightrope walk that is required for profound therapy. The therapist has a personal, highly inappropriate need for the patient's comfort. So how does he convert this, toxic feeling into a powerful, clinically useful intervention without harming the patient?
Yalom transforms this realization into the pivotal and deeply risky intervention. He challenges her relentless giving not to stop it, but to reframe it existentially. He tells her that by being totally giving, you don't let others get help from helping you. I'd never get to have the pleasure of offering you something. He's arguing that she is denying others the vital pleasure of being of service to her.
And this reframing just shatters her defense. Magnolia responds with this profound realization. I've never thought about it just like that. He calls her a good teacher for all her sacrificial work, and she's just deeply moved, weeping openly for several minutes. The intervention was so powerful because it was authentic. It was born from his own need, but it was delivered for her benefit. It addressed her isolation by creating a space where she could receive without feeling selfish.
The timing of this breakthrough is so intensely poignant. She reveals her raw vulnerability. Didn't tell you before, but tomorrow's the day my mama died. 1 year ago tomorrow. And Yalom, whose own mother had died just weeks prior, he recognizes that shared loss. And he breaks his professional rule, offering this rare personal gift. I know what that feels like, Magnolia. I lost my mother last month.
The final beautiful connection occurs in the corridor as Magnolia is being discharged. She's shabby and weary, and she asks him to wheel her over to a chair. She explains that she misses her mother, even though her mother was not a source of comfort or support. Magnolia simply needed her because she said for something I needed. And then she turns the insight back on the doctor, confirming his hidden grief. I think you're like me. You miss your mama too. Doctors need mamas too, just like mamas need mamas.
That idea that we need our parents just because they're there, regardless of what they gave us, regardless of their dysfunction, really lands hard, doesn't it? It completely reframes the purpose of presence over function.
Shifting back to the intensive, long-term outpatient work, we encounter Irene, a patient Yalom describes as one of the most complex, intelligent, stubborn, agonized, sensitive, imperious, elegant, hardworking, ingenious, unbending, courageous, attractive, proud, frosty, romantic, and infuriating women he ever treated.
Irene is a successful surgeon, and she's reeling from this immense, inconsolable grief. Her husband, Jack, died suddenly at 45, and that dredged up the prior trauma of losing her brother, Alan. Her very first dream established the magnitude of the work ahead of them. Pure gold intellectual ambrosia, featuring 2 texts titled The Death of Innocence, one ancient, one new.
The significance of that dream was enormous. The loss of her brother, Alan, had exploded her childhood innocence. It destroyed all the myths of justice, predictability, and benevolent deity. Her subsequent life choices, marrying Jack, entering medicine, there were all these frantic attempts to regain safety and control. And tellingly, she refused to marry Jack until he promised her not to die young on me. She was deadly serious about it. She was trying to preemptively negotiate with mortality.
In this struggle for safety, it led to a profound therapeutic conflict. Irene immediately identifies what she calls an unbridgeable gap between them. She accuses him of having a benign, shielded life insulated in an ivory tower. She believed Yalom, with his intact family and successful career, could never possibly understand her grief.
So the therapeutic relationship just stalls under the weight of her rage. And in one explosive session, Yalom risks everything. He reveals that his own brother-in-law had just died suddenly at 70, hoping this will bridge the gap. Irene, instead of offering condolences, just explodes with grief rage. She compares his loss to her own.
My husband died at 45. I can go into the OR every day. Then you sure as hell can come in here and see me. Her motivation was so clear. She hated everyone with an intact life, and she was comparing his loss to her own puny problems. She even accused him of manipulating her or setting some kind of test. And Yalom stood firm. He resisted the urge to shut down or retreat. He explained that not talking about the large, undeniable thing between them, grief, was a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
That willingness to receive her lethal stuff, as he puts it, that really defined their work.
The core philosophical struggle was reason versus treason. Yalom initially adopted the role of the existential rationalist. He systematically challenged her irrationality, forcing her to look at death, urging her to loosen her ties with Jack, take down photos, redecorate, stop talking to his ghost. He argued that if Jack was nowhere except in memory, then her guilt over finding joy or even considering another man was completely irrational.
But what he called logical reason, Irene called betrayal, or treason. Rejoining life felt like a betrayal to Jack. Detachment felt like abandonment. She saw Yalom as a smug, self-satisfied spectator just standing safely outside the disaster zone, and this impassive intellectual approach eventually stalled their therapy for 3 long years.
So for 3 years, it was just a stalemate, pretty much. And then Irene finally broke the impasse. She forced him to read Robert Frost's devastating poem, Home Burial. The poem describes an aloof husband who digs their child's grave briskly and a wife who is just inconsolable in her grief. And Irene delivered the revelation. The farmer and the wife in that poem are not my mother and my father. They're us, you and me.
That moment must have been seismic.
It was. She identified him as the aloof husband, the rationalist who tracked grave mud into the kitchen, chiding her for clinging to the loss. This forced him out of the spectator role and into the mud alongside her. This realization that his every rational word had caused offense, it shattered her 3 years of emotional silence, and she wept openly for the first time. The lesson there is that sometimes authenticity requires the therapist to temporarily abandon their position of objective reason.
This breakthrough was crucial because it allowed her to move toward acceptance. By confronting her avoidance of reality, she began to recognize that she had refused the loan of life in order to avoid the debt of death, an idea from Otto Rank. She wanted to keep the therapist, her guide, outside of time, without a personal narrative, so he couldn't die on her too.
And this leads to the final, beautiful resolution of the transference. After years of work, Irene notes, "It's strange, Irv, but you seem to have gotten a lot smaller." This signifies the end of her needing him as an omnipotent magus, an all-powerful wizard who could somehow negotiate her mortality for her. He's reduced to a human, a fellow traveler, on the same inevitable road. And this emotional acceptance allowed her to stop squandering her life and begin a genuine recovery, accepting that she couldn't keep the world safe just by being perpetually frozen in grief.
Now we move into the tales of Ernest Lash, who is Yalom's fictionalized stand-in, and this just plunges us into the most extreme examples of countertransference and ethical tightropes. These stories ask, what happens when the therapist's humanity, their failures, their secrets, becomes the actual curative factor?
Exactly. Ernest Lash, a psychiatrist, is using his therapy dictation and tapes for supervision. His patient, Linda, is actively resistant. She's constantly demeaning the process, another $150 pop, and she refuses to engage meaningfully in the here and now. She's frustrating, aggressive, and stagnant.
But Linda finds this incredible piece of leverage. She either overhears or later plays the tape of Ernest's unfiltered dictation. She hears him call her whining, boring, and vulgar. And even more explosively, she hears him confess sexual attraction, noting her great-looking chest popping those buttons.
This is a massive ethical breach, a huge one. Yet Linda weaponizes this secret knowledge, and her behavior completely transforms. She uses his criticisms as this secret clubbing knowledge to torment him, forcing him to address his negative feelings directly. Suddenly, she starts using sophisticated vocabulary from a thesaurus abyssal, Tartarian, to prove she's not boring. And she begins writing poetry, an activity she had abandoned since childhood because of her critical father.
The incredible irony is that Ernest's ethical transgression inadvertently creates the therapeutic material they needed for profound change. Linda finds this excitement in the secret. She becomes her own magus. And Ernest is forced to deal with his own feelings, to apologize for the t-shirt crack, and just to hang in there authentically.
What Yalom is showing us here is that the rigidity of professional distance sometimes just hides the truth. By being forced to deal with his own shame and his own attraction, Ernest was forced into a real, vulnerable relationship with Linda, which she could then use for growth. The secret knowledge boosted her self-esteem because she knew the therapist saw her as complex, irritating, and desirable. The cure wasn't the technique, it was the forced authenticity.
We see Ernest's pattern of being governed by his own shadow repeated in the next case with Halston, a reserved patient who abruptly terminates after only 4 sessions. Ernest, feeling the failure, forces Halston to recall the traumatic, drug-induced end of a one-night stand with a woman named Artemis. Halston recalls this terrifying nightmare of a giant, menacing black cat named Merges and a robot with breasts squirting radioactive liquid.
And Ernest, who is still grappling with his own abandonment issues from an ex-girlfriend named Myrna, identifies strongly and irrationally with Artemis. He becomes convinced he has a moral imperative to make amends for Halston's callous desertion of this woman. He starts thinking with what he calls his small head, his emotional, irrational self, and ignores all of his clinical training. Halston just calls Artemis's behavior her mode of life, refusing responsibility, but Ernest is consumed by this idea of correcting the wrong.
So, ignoring every professional boundary in the book, Ernest tracks Artemis down at a Mill Valley cafe. He fabricates a story about his own recent abandonment just to gain her empathy, and he is enchanted by her, noting her resemblance to his lovely Viennese aunts, another clear signal of countertransference. He's projecting his idealized maternal figures onto her.
After they share this marvelous, deeply connected evening, the generational cat curse works on Ernest just as it did on Halston. He forgets Artemis entirely for 72 hours, complete amnesia of her existence. Ernest realizes he has become the monster. He has deserted Artemis without a word, repeating the very pattern he sought to correct.
He confronts his own abandonment pattern firsthand, so on the second night, determined to set things right and understand this curse, Ernest returns to Artemis and experiences the terrifying cat curse dream himself. Merges, the hissing, massive black cat appears, but Ernest, now fully engaged and present, enters into a full-fledged existential debate with the feline.
Wait, he has an existential debate. With a cat. With a supernatural curse-wielding cat, yes. Merges reveals the curse was put on a woman named Clara and her female descendants by Merges himself, whose maid Clara had killed. The curse is, any man who loves them will be driven away in terror and forget their existence. And Merges explains he uses the curse to avoid using up his last life. But Ernest challenges this. He shifts the debate from revenge to meaning. Merges' revenge is complete, but his perpetual waiting life is soaked in ennui.
And this is the ultimate existential lesson delivered not to a patient, but to a supernatural cat?
It is, Ernest argues. I'd turn that question upside down, Merges. Perhaps death makes life more vital, more precious. The fact of death bestows a special poignancy, a bittersweet quality to life's activities. He convinces Merges that his perpetual waiting isn't really living, and he tells him, those who most fear death are the ones who approach it with too much unlived life inside them. The cat leaves, smaller, and with a graceful gait, having been taught the value of the finite.
The final, curative act is deeply moving. Ernest realizes the cost of his transgression and forces the truth with Artemis, admitting his irrationality and his guilt. She reveals she knew everything, the curse, his dream, his reasons for leaving, because she lives under this generational curse. The curse is broken not by an apology or a rational explanation, but by Ernest confronting his own pattern of desertion and the underlying existential terror. Having experienced the curse firsthand and faced his own vulnerability, Ernest is no longer susceptible to it. And in breaking his pattern, he breaks the generational curse for Artemis, who exclaims, I'm free. I know it. I feel it.
What an incredible journey through the self-doubts and profound breakthroughs of the therapist. The central theme that emerges time and again is the absolute necessity of engagement and authenticity in therapy. We've seen that the therapist has to risk their own personhood, bringing their vulnerability, whether it was Yalom confronting his mama issues or Ernest Lash exposing his abandonment trauma right into the room to achieve the deepest healing.
We've uncovered so many indispensable nuggets of knowledge here. The golden period of finding existential liberation in the face of death. The humbling realization that a life-reviewed dream might actually belong to the parent, reflecting their unlived life. The therapeutic power of converting countertransference like magnolia comfort into a life-affirming intervention. And Irene's powerful distinction between necessary reason and felt treason during inconsolable grief.
And the common thread through all of it is that the deepest work requires moving beyond clinical objectivity. As Yalom himself has learned through these tales, the good therapist must create a new therapy for each patient, one that accounts for the therapist's full, flawed humanity. The core curative factor is the therapist's ability to hang in there close and expose themselves to the patient's lethal stuff, the grief, the rage, the raw shame, without collapsing.
This exposure is not just for the patient. We've seen that the therapist's best tool is often their own failure, their own unresolved emotional pattern when they have the courage to face it. They must use their life fully. We've learned that those who most fear death are the ones who approach it with too much unlived life inside them. It's best to use all of life. Leave death nothing but the dregs, nothing but a burned out castle.
So we ask you to consider, what crucial vulnerability are you currently masking in your own life that, if exposed, if genuinely and authentically shared or confronted, might unlock the next profound phase of your growth? Are you carrying a dream that was never yours, or are you holding back parts of your life, leaving them for the dregs?